This is the last photo of 12-year-old Ethel Carpenter, just minutes before the catastrophe. Imagine a normal school day ending with a deafening blast that would forever change hundreds of families in a small Texas town. March 18, 1937 began like any other spring day in New London, Texas. The sun shone brightly as students at the Consolidated School prepared for the next day's interscholastic meet in Henderson. Among them was Ethel Carpenter, a young girl from a hard-working oil field family. Like many children in the area, Ethel's parents had weathered the Great Depression and took pride in sending their daughter to what was considered one of the wealthiest rural school districts in the United States. The massive E-shaped school building had been constructed at a cost of around $1 million, equivalent to about $23 million today, funded by the East Texas oil boom.
New London's taxable value had grown to an impressive $20 million, with additional revenue from 15 oil wells on district property. The crown jewel of the campus was the two-story junior and senior high school building, fully equipped with a chemistry lab, an auditorium with balcony, and an industrial arts workshop. That afternoon, Ethel sat in her classroom alongside her classmates. The school day was nearly over, just 13 minutes before dismissal, at 3:17 p.m. In another part of the building, the school's manual training instructor, Lemmy R. Butler, switched on an electric sander in the workshop area. Unknown to everyone in the building, a deadly trap had been set months earlier. In January 1937, the school board had made a fateful decision to save money. To cut the school's $300 monthly gas bill, they canceled their contract with United Gas Company and authorized plumbers to tap into a residue gas line from the nearby Parade Gasoline Company.
This practice, though not explicitly authorized by local oil companies, was common in the area. The wet or raw gas extracted with oil was considered a waste product and was typically flared off. Critically, this natural gas was both colorless and odorless. For weeks, gas had been leaking from a faulty connection and accumulating in the enclosed crawl space that ran the entire 253-foot length of the school building. Some students had complained of headaches, but no one made the connection to a gas leak. There was no smell to warn them of the danger building beneath their feet. When Butler turned on the sander, the electric switch created a spark that ignited the gas-air mixture. Witnesses would later report that the walls of the school bulged outward. The roof lifted momentarily from the building before crashing back down. In an instant, the massive structure collapsed, burying hundreds of students and teachers under tons of brick, steel, and concrete debris.
The explosion was heard 4 miles away. A 2-ton concrete slab was hurled 200 feet, landing on and crushing a parked car. Inside the gymnasium, located about 100 feet from the main building, 50 mothers attending a PTA meeting felt the blast and rushed outside to a scene of unimaginable horror. Ethel Carpenter was among the victims. Her brother survived the explosion, but Ethel and another sister did not. Bill Thompson, a classmate who had asked Ethel to swap seats with him shortly before the explosion, later told Ethel's brother Liddell that if she had been in her original seat, she might have survived. Liddell responded with remarkable stoicism, saying, "Well, Bill, it was her appointed time. I could have gotten killed, but it wasn't my time. My brother was in the explosion, and he survived. This was Ethel's time." Within minutes, the community mobilized. Parents, many of them roughnecks from the oil fields, rushed to the scene and began digging through the rubble with bare hands. Oil workers abandoned their rigs, bringing cutting torches and heavy equipment to clear the concrete and steel. School bus driver Lonnie Barber, who had witnessed the explosion while driving elementary students home, finished his 2-hour route before returning to search for his own 4 children. The disaster scene quickly became organized chaos. Medical professionals from throughout the region converged on New London. Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler canceled its grand opening ceremony scheduled for the following day to treat the injured. The Texas funeral directors sent 25 embalmers to help with the overwhelming number of casualties. A young journalist named Walter Cronkite, working for United Press in Dallas, was among the first reporters to reach the scene. Decades later, the retired CBS evening news anchor would reflect, "I did nothing in my studies, nor in my life, to prepare me for a story of the magnitude of that New London tragedy. Nor has any story since that awful day equaled it." Through the night, as rain fell, floodlights illuminated the grim rescue and recovery efforts. Within 17 hours, all victims and debris had been removed from the site. The final death toll would reach approximately 298 students and teachers, most from grades 5 through 11. Only about 130 students escaped serious injury. Many families lost multiple children in the catastrophe. In the aftermath, investigators determined that the catastrophe resulted from the faulty gas connection beneath the school. The odorless gas had accumulated undetected until that fateful spark from the workshop ignited it. Although more than 70 lawsuits were filed for damages, District Judge Robert T. Brown dismissed the few cases that came to trial for lack of evidence. No school officials were found liable. The most significant outcome of the disaster was the passage of a state odorization law requiring that malodorants be added to all natural gas for commercial and industrial use, making gas leaks detectable by smell. This safety measure was later adopted nationwide and continues to save lives today. For decades, survivors and families of victims rarely spoke about the tragedy. It took 40 years before the community could begin to discuss what happened that day. In 1939, a cenotaph of Texas pink granite was erected in front of the new school, designed by Donald S. Nelson and sculptor Herring Coe. The memorial stands as a somber reminder of lives cut short and lessons learned at tremendous cost. The 30 surviving seniors finished their year in temporary buildings, while a new school was constructed on nearly the same site. Today, a small museum in New London preserves artifacts and stories of that terrible day, ensuring that one of the worst school disasters in American history is not forgotten. The New London school explosion serves as a reminder of how a simple decision to save money, combined with a lack of safety measures, led to unimaginable tragedy. It's a stark lesson in how safety regulations, which we often take for granted, were sometimes written in the blood of innocent victims. This is the last photo of Peter Suderman, taken just 25 minutes before the most catastrophic industrial disaster in American history. Imagine a 35-year-old dock supervisor standing on the pier, unaware that in mere minutes he would be hurled 30 feet through the air as his workplace disintegrated in a blast felt hundreds of miles away. April 16, 1947 dawned with promise in Texas City. The weather was clear and crisp, cooled by a brisk north wind. Perfect conditions for loading cargo. At 38, Peter Suderman had worked his way up to become superintendent of stevedores at the bustling port. Respected by both management and the longshoremen under his supervision, he took pride in running an efficient, safe operation. That morning, like many before, began with routine tasks: organizing work crews, checking manifests, ensuring the day's loading went smoothly. The French vessel SS Grand Camp had arrived on April 11 and had already taken on 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. This morning, they would finish loading the remaining cargo. The fertilizer, packaged in paper sacks, was destined for the farmers of war-ravaged France. A gift from America to help rebuild Europe's agriculture after World War II. Alongside the fertilizer, the Grand Camp carried twine, peanuts, tobacco, cotton, and small ammunition. Just before 8 a.m., longshoremen removed the hatch covers on Hold 4 and descended into the cargo hold. Several men waited as the first pallets of 100-pound fertilizer bags were being prepared for loading. Then, someone noticed smoke rising between the cargo and the ship's hull, about 7 or 8 layers of sacks down. The smoke quickly intensified. A worker grabbed a gallon jug of water, and crew members brought 2 fire extinguishers, but these had little effect on the growing flames. As the hold filled with acrid smoke, Suderman ordered the longshoremen to evacuate immediately. Standing on the dock with Leonard Boswell, the gang foreman, Suderman discussed what action to take. The Grand Camp's captain approached, insisting in broken but intelligible English that water not be used to fight the fire. It would ruin his cargo. Instead, he ordered the hatches battened down, covered with tarpaulins, ventilators closed, and the steam system activated to smother the flames. What neither the captain nor Suderman realized was that this decision would prove catastrophic. Ammonium nitrate is an oxidizer, meaning it can sustain a fire without external oxygen. The steam likely converted the chemical to nitrous oxide, while intensifying the already extreme heat in the sealed compartment. By 8:30 a.m., conditions had deteriorated. Suderman and the stevedores were ordered to move away from the ship. The Grand Camp's whistle blasted an alarm, echoed by the Texas City Terminal Railway Company siren.
Despite a telephone workers' strike hampering communications, Suderman managed to reach the fire department and call Galveston for a fireboat. The fire created brilliantly colored smoke, described by witnesses as orange, gold, and yellow, visible across Texas City. The unusual spectacle drew onlookers to the docks, a common occurrence when port fires broke out. No one, including Suderman with his years of maritime experience, comprehended the danger building inside the Grand Camp's hold. None knew that the fertilizer's packaging gave no indication of its explosive potential. The bags simply read, fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate. At 9:12 a.m., the unthinkable happened. With a deafening roar, the Grand Camp disintegrated in an explosion so powerful it registered on seismographs in Denver, Colorado, nearly 1,000 miles away. The blast hurled the ship's 1.5-ton anchor more than a mile and a half from the docks. A mushroom cloud of fire and debris billowed 2,000 feet into the sky. The explosion triggered a 15-foot tidal wave that crashed onto the dock and surrounding area. In that instant, Suderman was thrown 30 feet across the pier, wooden planks from the dock flying alongside him. The force that could rip apart a steel vessel somehow spared his life, though many around him weren't as fortunate. Nearly all the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department perished in that moment. Workers at the nearby Monsanto Chemical Company plant, just 300 feet from the slip where Grand Camp had been docked, suffered devastating casualties. 145 of 450 employees killed instantly. In the chaotic aftermath, the wounded and shocked survivors like Suderman faced a hellish landscape. The port was unrecognizable. Warehouses flattened, oil tanks ruptured and burning, buildings reduced to twisted metal. Without a functioning hospital in Texas City, the injured were taken to makeshift facilities in the City Hall and Chamber of Commerce buildings, while the more seriously wounded were evacuated to Galveston and Houston. The disaster wasn't over. The SS Highflyer, docked nearby and also carrying ammonium nitrate, had been damaged and set afire by the first explosion. Despite attempts to tow it away from the harbor, it remained stuck. At 1:10 a.m. on April 17th, approximately 16 hours after the Grand Camp exploded, the Highflyer detonated in a second massive blast, compounding the destruction. What few realized at the time was how preventable the catastrophe had been. The danger of ammonium nitrate was known but poorly communicated. The Port of Houston had actually prohibited the loading of this fertilizer months earlier, after chemical analysis revealed its hazards. No special safety precautions were implemented in Texas City, and the longshoremen, stevedores, ship crews, and even firefighters had no idea they were handling a potentially explosive material. In the following weeks, Suderman, like many survivors, assisted with the grim task of recovery and identification. The official death toll would eventually reach 581, though many believe the actual number was higher, as some victims, particularly foreign sailors and transient workers, were never officially reported missing. For the rest of his life, Peter Suderman would carry the memories of that spring morning when the world exploded around him, and he was thrown across the pier, yet somehow survived to tell the tale.
The Texas City disaster fundamentally changed industrial safety standards, port regulations, and chemical handling procedures across America. Lessons written in the blood of those who perished on what began as an ordinary April workday. This is the last photo of James Miller, just 20 minutes before the dormitory roof would collapse and claim his life. Imagine a bright engineering student studying late while his roommates attended the historic first-night football game in UT Austin's history. No one could have predicted the deteriorating wooden supports would give way that night. James Miller was the kind of student professors remembered. The second son of Harold and Elizabeth Miller from Galveston, he'd earned his spot at the University of Texas through relentless academic dedication. His father worked at the Port of Galveston as a foreman, saving every extra dollar for his boy's education. James's older brother had already graduated with a degree in business, and now all family hopes centered on James becoming the first engineer in the family. September 17, 1955 started like any Saturday for James. After breakfast at the campus cafeteria, he spent most of the day in the library preparing for his upcoming exams. His dormitory, Roberts Hall, was one of the older residences on campus, built in the late 1920s. The three-story brick building housed approximately 120 male students, mainly sophomores and juniors. The rooms were simple: 2 beds, 2 desks, and a shared closet. The top floor, where James lived in room 312, had sloped ceilings following the roofline. That evening, something historic was happening on campus. For decades, UT football games had traditionally started at 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoons. But on September 17, 1955, the university was hosting its first ever night game against Texas Tech, having finally installed lights at the stadium. Nearly everyone on campus was planning to attend this momentous event. Everyone except James, who had promised his father he would maintain his 4.0 GPA no matter what. At approximately 6:40 p.m., James's roommate Thomas Green stopped by to try once more to convince him to join the festivities. "Come on, you can study tomorrow. This is history!" But James simply smiled and shook his head. Thomas snapped a quick photo of James at his desk, the lamp illuminating his textbooks, before heading out with their hallmates. "Your loss, Miller," he called as he left. That photo would later become a haunting reminder of the tragedy to come. What no one knew was that the unusually heavy summer rainfall had been slowly compromising the wooden roof supports of the aging dormitory. The building had been scheduled for renovation the following summer, but university officials had deemed it safe for one more academic year. A subsequent investigation would reveal that termite damage, coupled with water infiltration, had critically weakened the central support beam above the 3rd floor. At approximately 7 p.m., while most of campus emptied toward the stadium, students in nearby buildings reported hearing a loud cracking sound, followed by what one witness described as a thunderous crash. The central section of Roberts Hall's roof had collapsed, sending tons of wooden beams, roofing materials, and ceiling plaster onto the 3rd floor rooms below. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the damage was catastrophic. 3 students who had also skipped the game were injured, one with a broken leg, another with a concussion, and a third with lacerations requiring 47 stitches. James Miller, however, was found beneath a massive wooden beam that had fallen directly onto his desk. The county medical examiner determined he had died instantly from traumatic head injuries. The campus community was stunned. The historic first night game continued without interruption, as officials decided announcing the tragedy would cause unnecessary panic. It wasn't until students returned to their dormitories that the news began to spread. By morning, the university flag flew at half-mast, and President Logan Wilson issued a statement expressing profound grief and promising a thorough investigation. What many don't know is that James had actually written to his parents just the week before, mentioning strange creaking noises in the ceiling of his room. He had reported it to the dormitory supervisor, who made a note to have maintenance check it after the weekend. The maintenance request form was found in the supervisor's office, never having reached the facilities department. In the aftermath, the university implemented sweeping changes to its building inspection protocols. The remaining 2 sections of Robert Hall were immediately evacuated, and the building was demolished by the end of the year. The Texas legislature passed what became known as the Miller Act in 1956, requiring all public university buildings in the state to undergo structural inspection twice yearly. James's parents established the James Miller Memorial Scholarship for engineering students, which continues to this day. His desk, salvaged from the wreckage, is now displayed in the engineering building as a somber reminder of the importance of structural integrity and building safety. For the UT Austin community, September 17, 1955, is remembered not only as the date of their first night football game, but as the day they learned that academic ambition could come at the ultimate price. James Miller's dedication to his studies cost him his life, but his legacy lives on in every safety inspection, every building code, and every scholarship recipient who follows in his engineering footsteps. This is the last photo of Sandra Miller, a 28-year-old clerk typist at Continental Insurance, taken just 45 minutes before a catastrophic wall collapse claimed her life and injured 6 others at their downtown Dallas office. What started as an ordinary September morning in 1966 would end in one of the city's most overlooked workplace tragedies, a disaster that would eventually change building safety codes across Texas. Sandra had joined Continental Insurance just 11 months earlier after moving from her small hometown of Haltom City. A diligent worker known for her precise typing skills, she'd recently been promoted to the claims department on the 3rd floor of the aging Commerce Street building. Friends described her as quietly ambitious, saving money for business school while supporting her widowed mother. That fateful morning began like any other. Sandra arrived at 8:15 a.m., exchanged pleasantries with the security guard, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The brick building, constructed in 1923, had been showing concerning signs for months. Hairline cracks along the western wall, occasional plaster falling from ceilings, and windows that had become increasingly difficult to open. Maintenance requests had been filed repeatedly, but corporate headquarters in Chicago had delayed major repairs, citing budgetary constraints. At 10:30 a.m., Sandra's coworker Jack Reynolds snapped a photo of her at her desk, capturing her warm smile as she sorted through insurance claims. The Polaroid would later become a haunting artifact, the last image of Sandra alive. In it, she sits confidently at her metal desk, IBM Selectric typewriter before her, the problematic western wall visible just behind her station. By 11:07 a.m., the office was bustling with activity. Sandra was typing correspondence about an auto insurance claim while her colleagues worked nearby. Suddenly, several employees reported hearing an ominous creaking sound. Witnesses would later describe a low rumble, followed by the appearance of a massive crack racing diagonally across the western wall. In those terrifying final moments, chaos erupted as employees scrambled toward exits. Sandra, seated directly beside the failing structure, had almost no time to react. According to survivor testimonies, she had just stood from her desk when the 30-foot section of brick and masonry broke free, collapsing inward with devastating force. The wall's failure was catastrophic and immediate. Over 6 tons of brick, concrete, and steel framework crashed down, engulfing Sandra's workspace and adjacent areas. 5 employees managed to escape with injuries, while another was trapped for nearly 2 hours before rescuers could reach her. Sandra, however, was declared dead at the scene. The investigation that followed revealed years of neglect and structural compromise. Water damage from faulty drainage had gradually weakened the wall's integrity, while unauthorized renovations in 1958 had removed a crucial support beam to create more office space. City inspectors had flagged potential issues during a routine visit in early 1965, but follow-up enforcement had fallen through administrative cracks. Perhaps most tragically, internal company memos recovered during subsequent litigation showed that Continental's facilities manager had requested emergency repairs just 3 weeks before the collapse. The request was denied by regional management, who scheduled an inspection for the following month, an appointment that came too late. The collapse led to significant changes in Dallas building codes and inspection protocols. By 1968, the city had implemented new requirements for structural assessments of aging commercial buildings, creating a legacy of improved workplace safety that Sandra Miller never lived to see.
For Sandra's mother, Elizabeth, the loss was devastating. "She was my only child," she told the Dallas Morning News in a rare interview months later. "She had such plans for her future." Sandra's desk calendar, recovered from the rubble, showed she had circled October 15th, the date she would have started night classes at Southern Methodist University. The Continental Insurance Building was fully demolished in December 1966, and a modern office complex now stands in its place. No plaque commemorates the tragedy that occurred there, and few Dallas residents today remember the incident that claimed Sandra Miller's life and changed how the city approached building safety. This is the last photo of the Johnson family, taken just 15 minutes before their farmstead was torn apart by the tornado of May 4th, 1928. Imagine, one moment they're standing proudly on their porch, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. The next, their lives would be forever altered by one of Houston's earliest documented twisters. The day began like any other spring morning for Thomas Johnson, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children. Mary, age 14, Robert, age 12, and little Sarah, just 6 years old. Thomas had worked tirelessly for 8 years to build their modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Houston. The property wasn't large, but it was theirs. A small cattle operation with a vegetable garden Eleanor tended with pride. That morning, Thomas had commented on the unusual stillness in the air, what meteorologists now recognize as the calm before a supercell thunderstorm. Eleanor Johnson was a practical woman. Having grown up in Kansas, she knew the telltale signs of dangerous weather. When the sky turned an eerie shade of green around 3:30 that afternoon, she called the children in from the fields where they had been helping their father with the spring planting. A family friend who had come to help with the farm work snapped their photo on the porch. Thomas with his arm around Eleanor, the children arranged by height in front of them. Behind them, dark clouds were already visible on the horizon. What happened in the next 15 minutes would become part of Houston's forgotten weather history. According to newspaper accounts from the Houston Chronicle, the tornado formed suddenly, dropping from a severe thunderstorm that had developed over Fort Bend County before moving northeast toward the Johnson property. Weather monitoring was primitive in 1928. No Doppler radar, no warning systems, just the human eye and farmers' intuition built over generations. Thomas Johnson spotted the funnel cloud first. "Get to the root cellar!" he shouted to his family. The Johnsons had dug a small storm shelter beneath their home after moving from Kansas, a precaution many of their Houston neighbors had deemed unnecessary. As the wind began to howl with increasing intensity, Thomas helped Eleanor and the children down the narrow stairs. The roar grew louder. Survivors often describe it as a freight train, and Thomas realized he'd forgotten to secure the livestock. In a fateful decision, he turned back toward the barn. The tornado struck with stunning ferocity. Meteorologists later estimated it as what would now be classified as an F2 tornado, with winds between 113 to 157 miles per hour. The farmhouse's wooden structure offered little resistance. Witnesses from neighboring farms described seeing the roof tear away first, followed by walls collapsing inward. The barn where Thomas had run to save their 2 horses was lifted entirely from its foundation and splintered across the property. In the storm cellar, Eleanor clutched her children as the world above them disintegrated. The sound was deafening. Wood splintering, glass shattering, and the tornado's unrelenting roar. Little Sarah later recalled to the Houston Press, "It sounded like the world was ending."
For 2 terrifying minutes, they huddled in darkness as debris rained down, partially blocking the cellar door. When silence finally returned, Eleanor pushed against the cellar door, but it wouldn't budge. Trapped by debris, they called out for Thomas. There was no answer. It took nearly an hour before they heard voices above, neighbors who had seen the destruction and come to help. When they were finally pulled from the cellar, the Johnsons emerged to a scene of complete devastation. Their home was gone. The barn was gone. And Thomas was nowhere to be found. The search for Thomas Johnson continued through the evening and into the night. Neighbors formed search parties, calling his name across the flattened farmland. It was Robert who found his father's body, nearly 400 yards from where the barn had stood, his work clothes torn by debris, his body broken by the tornado's violence. Thomas Johnson became one of the 7 confirmed fatalities from the tornado that day. But here's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Thomas wasn't supposed to be on the farm that day at all. According to family letters discovered decades later, Thomas had planned to be in downtown Houston for a business meeting. He had postponed it that morning, sensing something in the air that troubled him. Had he kept that appointment, he would have been miles from the tornado's path. A simple decision, the kind we all make daily, had sealed his fate. The 1928 tornado that claimed Thomas Johnson's life wasn't the largest or most destructive in Houston's history. It didn't level entire neighborhoods or make national headlines. But for the Johnson family, it was the dividing line between before and after. Eleanor never remarried. With help from neighbors and her children, she rebuilt a smaller home on the same property. The insurance money from Thomas's life policy kept the family afloat, while Mary and Robert took on adult responsibilities far too soon. What makes this tornado particularly notable to meteorologists was its unusual formation. According to weather records from that period, the storm developed on what had been forecasted as a moderate-risk day, not the high-risk conditions typically associated with destructive tornadoes. It formed quickly and dissipated almost as rapidly after cutting a relatively narrow path through rural Houston. This pattern would later be recognized as characteristic of Texas spring tornadoes, which can develop with frightening speed. The aftermath reveals the resilience of both the Johnson family and the Houston farming community. Neighbors rallied around Eleanor and her children, helping to clear debris, rebuild fences, and provide temporary shelter. Within a year, the Johnsons had a new, smaller home on their property. Mary eventually became a school teacher in Houston. Robert joined the military during World War II, and Sarah, the youngest, went on to study meteorology, inspired by the event that took her father. Today, the land where the Johnson farm once stood is part of suburban Houston, with no visible reminder of the tragedy that occurred there. But the legacy of that storm lives on in improved weather monitoring systems and tornado preparedness that have saved countless lives since. What if Thomas Johnson had checked the barometer that morning and recognized the severe drop in pressure? What if Houston had had the tornado warning systems we take for granted today? These questions haunt us when we look at that final photograph. A family unaware that within minutes, their lives would be irrevocably changed by the capricious violence of nature. This is the last photo of Raymond Miller, taken just 35 minutes before the catastrophic scaffolding collapse that would claim his life. Imagine, standing 14 stories above Fort Worth's growing skyline, the summer breeze pulling at your clothes while the weight of your safety depends on wood planking and metal pipes assembled by tired hands. Raymond Miller was 37 years old in the summer of 1949. A World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific, he'd returned to Fort Worth with dreams of helping rebuild America in peacetime. Like many veterans, he found reliable work in construction as the post-war building boom transformed cities across America. Ray, as friends called him, had a wife, Margaret, and 2 young children, Tommy, 8, and Susan, 6. They lived in a modest home in the south side of Fort Worth that Ray had spent weekends fixing up himself. Each morning, Ray would kiss his wife goodbye and tousle his kids' hair, before heading to the construction site of what would become the Western Insurance Building in downtown Fort Worth. It was one of several new high-rises going up as part of the city's post-war expansion. That fateful morning of July 15, 1949, seemed no different. The summer heat had already settled in by 7 a.m. when Ray clocked in and climbed the scaffolding that hugged the building's exterior. At precisely 10:25 a.m., a coworker snapped a photo of Ray standing at the edge of the scaffolding platform, checking measurements on the 14th floor. Ray was smiling, his lunch pail visible beside him, completely unaware of the failing metal coupling that connected the scaffolding to the building's facade. This innocent moment, captured on film, would be the last record of Ray alive. According to witnesses and the subsequent investigation, at approximately 11 a.m., a terrible creaking sound echoed through the construction site. Workers recalled hearing shouts and then a thunderous crash as the scaffolding section where Ray and two other workers stood suddenly collapsed. The other men, James Wilson and Frank Garza, managed to grab onto protruding steel beams, sustaining serious injuries but surviving. Ray, however, had been standing at the outer edge of the platform, checking exterior measurements. He fell 14 stories to the ground below. First responders arrived within minutes, but Ray was pronounced dead at the scene. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram's evening edition carried the story on its front page, reporting the tragic death of the young family man and veteran. The article noted that it was the third fatal construction accident in Fort Worth that year. In the days that followed, investigators from the newly formed Texas Department of Public Safety examined the scene. Their report, filed on July 20, 1949, concluded that the accident resulted from metal fatigue in a critical scaffolding support. The component had been previously flagged for replacement during an inspection the week before, but due to material shortages common in the post-war building boom, the replacement had been delayed. The investigation revealed a tragic twist. Ray himself had documented the failing component in his site notes just 3 days earlier. A colleague later testified that Ray had expressed concern about continuing work on that section of scaffolding, but was assured by a supervisor that it would hold until replacement parts arrived the following week. Ray's funeral was held at Greenwood Memorial Park, attended by over 200 people, including nearly every worker from the construction site. His wife Margaret, devastated by the loss, was left to raise their 2 children alone. The family received a small settlement from the construction company, but it was hardly enough to replace the income and support Ray would have provided. The tragedy wasn't entirely in vain. Ray's death, along with several other high-profile construction accidents in the late 1940s, contributed to the push for stronger workplace safety regulations. Within months, the Fort Worth City Council passed new ordinances requiring more frequent inspections of construction scaffolding and stricter enforcement of safety protocols. These local measures would later influence statewide construction safety standards. The Western Insurance Building was eventually completed in 1950, but workers installed a small memorial plaque in the lobby commemorating the men who lost their lives during its construction, including Raymond Miller. The plaque remained there until the building was renovated in the 1980s. Margaret Miller never remarried. She worked as a secretary at a local law firm to support her family. Ray's son Tommy would later join the military himself, serving in Vietnam, while daughter Susan became a nurse, both carrying forward their father's legacy of service to others. Today, few remember the tragedy that unfolded high above Fort Worth streets on that summer day in 1949. The building where Ray lost his life still stands, though it has changed hands and names several times over the decades. But the legacy of Raymond Miller and others like him lives on in the improved safety standards that protect construction workers across America. As we look back at that final photograph, a smiling man unaware of his fate, we're reminded that behind every statistic is a human story. Ray Miller's life ended too soon, but the changes sparked by his death may have saved countless others in the decades that followed. This is the last photo of Robert Harmon, just 45 minutes before the earth beneath San Antonio would change his life forever. Imagine sitting in your motel room, television flickering with news of the Apollo 13 disaster, completely unaware that in less than an hour, you too would be fighting for survival. April 16, 1970. A Thursday evening that began like any other for Robert Harmon, a 45-year-old petroleum engineer from Houston. After a long day inspecting drilling operations south of San Antonio, he checked into room 114 at the Westward Motor Inn on Loop 410, planning to head back to his wife and 3 children the following morning. Robert was no stranger to San Antonio. His work frequently brought him to the region, examining potential drilling sites and consulting on extraction methods. Colleagues described him as methodical, detail-oriented, and cautious, ironic traits for a man who would soon fall victim to something impossible to predict. The day had been unseasonably warm, reaching 84 degrees by mid-afternoon. Robert had spent most of it in the field, evaluating a promising site near Pleasanton, about 35 miles south of San Antonio. The area had been experiencing increased oil and gas exploration activity, with several new wells being drilled throughout 1969 and early 1970. "I just need a shower and a cold beer," he reportedly told the motel receptionist as he collected his room key. Security footage from the motel lobby captured Robert in his final documented moments. Tan slacks, blue button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves, and his characteristic wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a brown leather briefcase containing drilling reports and geological surveys. This ordinary image would later become the final visual record of Robert before tragedy struck. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Robert called his wife, Margaret, back in Houston. Their conversation lasted 12 minutes. Margaret would later recall that her husband sounded tired, but in good spirits. He mentioned plans to take their sons fishing that weekend at Lake Conroe and reminded her about their anniversary dinner reservation the following week. Their last words were a simple exchange of "love you," a mundane yet poignant final conversation. After hanging up, Robert ordered a club sandwich from room service, which arrived at 8:43 p.m. The young server, Timothy Garza, would later provide one of the final accounts of seeing Robert alive. "He tipped me $1 and was watching the news," Garza recalled in a subsequent police statement. "He seemed relaxed, just a normal guy unwinding after work." What happened at 9:30 p.m. would later become the subject of extensive geological study and debate. According to seismograph readings from Trinity University, a magnitude 3.8 earthquake occurred with an epicenter near Pleasanton, precisely where Robert had been working earlier that day. While considered minor by global standards, this localized tremor had unusual characteristics that made it particularly dangerous in that specific location. Geologists would later determine that the quake, though relatively small in magnitude, created an amplified effect in the specific area of the Westward Motor Inn due to the underlying soil composition and proximity to a previously unidentified fault line. The motel, constructed in 1962, stood on what engineers would later discover was poorly compacted fill soil with high clay content, a dangerous combination when subjected to seismic activity. The first tremor lasted approximately 8 seconds. Guests in adjacent rooms reported hearing a low rumbling, followed by violent shaking. Room 116 occupant James Whitfield described it as feeling like a freight train was running directly under the building. The initial quake caused minimal structural damage throughout most of San Antonio, with reports of rattling windows and swaying light fixtures extending as far north as the downtown area. However, at the Westward Motor Inn, the effect was catastrophic. The western wing of the single-story structure, which included Robert's room, suffered a partial collapse when support columns shifted and the roof caved inward. Emergency calls flooded local switchboards at 9:32 p.m., with the first police units arriving at the scene by 9:47 p.m. What rescue workers discovered was a scene of controlled chaos. Most guests had evacuated safely, gathering in the parking lot in various states of dress. However, 3 rooms in the western wing had sustained severe damage. First responders immediately began searching through the debris, prioritizing rooms where guests were known to be present. Robert Harmon was found in the bathroom of room 114, where he had apparently taken shelter when the shaking began. A section of the ceiling had collapsed, pinning him against the bathtub. Despite being quickly extracted and receiving immediate medical attention, he was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital at 11:22 p.m. The official cause of death was listed as internal hemorrhaging due to crush injuries. In a cruel twist of fate, Robert was the only fatality from the earthquake. 7 other people sustained injuries ranging from minor cuts to broken bones, but all recovered. This isolated tragedy would become a footnote in Texas earthquake history, the first and only direct earthquake fatality within state borders. The aftermath revealed a disturbing connection that would only become clear months later. The epicenter of the earthquake corresponded precisely with an area where fluid injection for secondary oil recovery had recently intensified. The Pleasanton oil field, where Robert had been working that very day, had begun a new phase of operations in February 1970, injecting thousands of gallons of wastewater into depleted wells to force out remaining oil. Though the science was not well understood at the time, subsequent investigations would establish one of the earliest documented cases of what geologists now call an induced seismic event, an earthquake triggered by human activity. The pressure created by injecting fluids had reactivated a dormant fault line, literally shaking the earth beneath San Antonio. The irony was inescapable. Robert, an oil industry professional, had fallen victim to the unintended consequences of the very industry he served. His death would eventually lead to changes in injection well regulations and a greater awareness of human-induced seismicity in Texas, though these reforms came too slowly for the Harmon family. Margaret Harmon never remarried. She raised their 3 sons alone, eventually establishing the Harmon Foundation for Seismic Safety, which advocated for stricter building codes in areas with potential seismic activity. Their middle son, Michael, followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a petroleum engineer, but with a specialization in environmental impact assessment, work directly influenced by the circumstances of his father's death. The Westward Motor Inn was repaired and continued operating until 1986, when it was demolished to make way for a shopping center. Today, nothing marks the spot where Robert Harmon spent his final moments, though a small plaque commemorating the 1970 earthquake can be found in the Pleasanton Public Library, noting its significance in Texas geological history. Perhaps the most profound legacy of this obscure tragedy is how it foreshadowed the future relationship between human activity and seismic events in Texas. What was once considered a geological anomaly is now understood as an early warning of the consequences of intensive resource extraction. Today, as earthquake activity increases throughout the state, particularly in areas with hydraulic fracturing operations, geologists and industry professionals alike point to the 1970 San Antonio earthquake as a pivotal moment in understanding man-made seismic risks. The last photo of Robert Harmon, a tired man checking into a motel after a day's work, serves as both a personal memorial and a somber reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not as stable as we might believe. His story, nearly forgotten in the wider chronicle of natural disasters, continues to resonate with those who study the hidden connections between human activity and the Earth's unpredictable response. This is the last photo taken of Carolyn Jones, just 30 minutes before disaster struck. Imagine, a bright-eyed 9-year-old girl posing with her classmates, unaware that in half an hour, her school would become the site of the deadliest school tragedy in American history. On March 18, 1937, Carolyn Jones woke up excited for the weekend ahead. As the daughter of an oil field worker in the booming town of New London, Texas, she enjoyed a relatively privileged education. The London School, built in 1932 at a cost of $1 million, equivalent to $23 million today, was among the wealthiest rural schools in America. The massive E-shaped structure of steel and concrete represented the prosperity that had come with the East Texas oil boom. For Carolyn, it was simply where she learned her lessons, made friends, and dreamed of her future. That morning, Carolyn's mother had packed her a special lunch and reminded her they'd go shopping for new spring clothes after school. Like many families in New London, the Jones family had found economic security despite the Great Depression, thanks to the oil industry that dominated the region. As far as the eye could see, oil derricks dotted the landscape, pumping black gold from the earth and prosperity into the community. Throughout the day, Carolyn and some of her classmates complained of headaches and stinging eyes. Her teacher dismissed these complaints, unaware of the invisible danger accumulating beneath their feet. Unknown to anyone in the building, natural gas had been leaking from a faulty connection. The school board had recently made the cost-saving decision to tap into residue gas lines from a nearby oil company, a common but dangerous practice in the community. At that time, natural gas was colorless and odorless. There was no way to detect the deadly vapor as it filled the enclosed space beneath the school building. At 3:02 p.m., Carolyn sat at her desk, watching the clock. In just 28 minutes, the final bell would ring and the weekend would begin. She'd been practicing her penmanship, carefully forming each letter as the teacher had instructed. Some of her classmates were fidgeting, eager for dismissal, while others focused intently on their lessons. Parents were gathering in the gymnasium for a PTA meeting, discussing plans for the upcoming spring events. At precisely 3:17 p.m., in the manual training shop in the school's basement, a teacher switched on an electric sander. The simple act created a spark that ignited the accumulated gas. What happened next occurred with such violence that witnesses would struggle to find words to describe it for the rest of their lives. The walls of the school bulged outward. The roof lifted into the air, then crashed back down as the main structure collapsed. The explosion was heard 4 miles away, sending a shockwave that shattered windows in nearby buildings. Inside, students and teachers experienced a moment of terrible confusion. Desks hurled across rooms, chunks of ceiling raining down, and a white haze of plaster dust filling the air. The force threw some children clear of the building, while others were instantly crushed beneath tons of concrete and steel. Outside, parents attending the PTA meeting in the separate gymnasium building heard the deafening blast. A mother screamed, "Oh my God, it's our children," as they rushed toward the devastation. Oil field workers dropped their tools and ran toward the school from all directions, their faces grim with the knowledge that their own children might be trapped inside. What they found was apocalyptic. A massive pile of rubble where a school had stood moments before, punctuated by the screams of injured children and the eerie silence of those who would never make a sound again. Carolyn Jones was among the fortunate few in her section of the building. Though buried under debris, she was pulled free by rescuers within the first hour. Her injuries were serious: a broken arm, severe lacerations, and internal bruising. But she would survive. Many of her classmates were not so lucky. The explosion ultimately claimed approximately 295 lives, mostly children, between the ages of 10 and 17. Through the night, more than 2,000 rescuers worked by floodlight and flare, frantically moving rubble by hand in search of survivors. Oil-stained workers dug until their hands bled, refusing to stop even as hope dimmed. By morning, rain began to fall, washing away blood and dust, but not the horror. Identification of victims became a grim process. Many bodies were so mangled that parents identified their children by clothing fragments or personal items. One boy was identified by the pull string from his favorite shirt found in his pocket. In the chaos, some desperate parents fought over remains, crying, "That's mine," as they sought to claim their children. What few people know is that before the explosion, a teacher had written on the blackboard, "Oil and natural gas are East Texas's greatest mineral blessings. Without them, this school would not be here, and none of us would be here learning our lessons." This blackboard was found intact among the rubble, a cruel irony that would haunt the community for generations. In the days that followed, the world learned of New London's tragedy. Telegrams of condolence arrived from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and even German Chancellor Adolf Hitler. But for the people of New London, there was no comfort to be found in international attention. Within 10 days, classes resumed in makeshift classrooms and the surviving gymnasium. The community pushed forward with grim determination, their grief too raw to process openly. Here's where Carolyn Jones enters history again. Still healing from her injuries, the 9-year-old survivor spoke before the Texas legislature as they met in emergency session. Her testimony about the importance of safety in schools helped drive the passage of new laws requiring that malodorant, the rotten egg smell, be added to natural gas so leaks could be detected. The legislature also passed the Engineering Registration Act, ensuring that only licensed professionals could call themselves engineers in Texas. These changes would save countless lives in the decades to come. Yet despite its magnitude, the New London school explosion faded from national memory. For decades, even local residents refused to discuss it, burying their trauma as deeply as they had buried their children. It was not until 1977, 40 years later, that survivors held their first reunion, finally giving voice to a grief that had been silently carried for nearly half a century. Today, a granite cenotaph on Highway 42 stands as a memorial to those lost. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy is invisible. It's the distinctive odor you smell when there's a gas leak, a safety feature implemented nationwide because of this tragedy. Every time a family is awakened by that telltale rotten egg smell and escapes a potential disaster, they owe their lives to the children of New London and to a brave 9-year-old girl named Carolyn Jones, who turned her survival into salvation for others. This is the last photo of James Harmon taken in the lobby of the Paso del Norte Hotel, just 30 minutes before he vanished without a trace. Imagine a successful 30-year-old businessman checking in for what should have been a routine 2-night stay, unaware that he would soon become one of El Paso's most perplexing cold cases. It was Friday, March 13, 1959, when Harmon arrived in El Paso after a long drive from Dallas. Friends described him as ambitious and meticulous, a rising star at Westfield Manufacturing, where he'd recently been promoted to regional sales manager. His new position required regular travel throughout the Southwest, making connections with potential distributors across state lines and into Mexico. That fateful weekend, James had planned to meet with several business associates just across the border in Ciudad Juarez. According to hotel records, he checked in around 4:15 p.m., paid for 2 nights in advance with cash, and requested a quiet room with a view of the Franklin Mountains. The desk clerk later recalled that Harmon seemed tired but in good spirits, making small talk about the unseasonably warm weather as he signed the registration card. Hotel staff remember seeing him enter the elevator around 4:45 p.m., carrying his suitcase and a leather portfolio containing business documents. Harmon was scheduled to meet with Mexican businessman Ernesto Fuentes at the hotel bar at 7:30 that evening, according to Fuentes' later statement to police. But James never appeared for that meeting. What happened in those crucial hours between check-in and his planned business dinner? Hotel records show his room key was used only once, when he first entered room 412. The bed remained untouched, though his suitcase had been opened and some clothes had been hung in the closet. His passport and wallet were found in the room safe, along with $230 in cash, a substantial amount in 1959. His 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air remained parked in the hotel lot, keys still with the valet. The first sign that something was wrong came when Fuentes called the front desk after waiting for nearly an hour at the bar. A bellhop was sent to check the room, but found no response to his knocking. It wasn't until the following morning, when Harmon failed to answer wake-up calls, that hotel management used a passkey to enter the room. Inside, they found Harmon's belongings, but no trace of the man himself. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, Police Detective Frank Martinez told the El Paso Herald-Post. No signs of struggle, nothing missing except the man himself. The disappearance occurred just 2 years after the infamous Patterson case had shocked El Paso, another unexplained vanishing that had left local law enforcement baffled. The investigation revealed that Harmon had made 3 phone calls from his hotel room. One to his office in Dallas, one to an unknown number in Juarez, and a final call to the hotel front desk, requesting information about currency exchange services. Telephone records confirmed these calls were made between 5:10 and 5:45 p.m. The hotel operator who handled his last call reported nothing unusual about his demeanor or requests. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered a notepad by the hotel phone with an address scrawled on it. 1420 Calle Durango, Juarez. When authorities checked the location, they found an abandoned warehouse that showed no signs of recent activity. Harmon's company confirmed he had no legitimate business at that address. A maid working on the 4th floor reported seeing a well-dressed Hispanic man knocking on Harmon's door around 6:15 p.m., though she couldn't identify him from photographs of Harmon's known associates. This unidentified visitor remains the last person known to have had potential contact with Harmon before his disappearance. The most chilling twist came 3 days later. A hotel guest 2 doors down from Harmon's room reported hearing what sounded like a muffled argument around 6:30 p.m. on the night Harmon vanished. She hadn't reported it immediately, assuming it was just a marital dispute. It was quick, maybe 30 seconds of raised voices, then nothing, she told investigators. I heard what sounded like something heavy hitting the floor, then silence. The timing of Cold War tensions cannot be overlooked. FBI records declassified decades later revealed that several Soviet intelligence operatives were suspected of operating in the El Paso-Juarez corridor in the late 1950s. While no direct connection to Harmon was ever established, his company did manufacture specialized mechanical components that had applications in military equipment, raising questions about whether he may have been targeted for industrial espionage. What makes Harmon's case particularly baffling is how a 6-foot-tall man could disappear from a busy downtown hotel during peak hours without a single confirmed sighting. Hotel security procedures in 1959 were minimal by today's standards. No surveillance cameras, no electronic key cards tracking room entry, and staff who were accustomed to giving guests privacy rather than monitoring their movements. After 6 months of investigation, authorities had pursued every lead without success. The case grew cold. James Harmon's family offered a $10,000 reward for information, a substantial sum for the time, but no credible tips emerged. His company eventually declared him legally dead in 1966, 7 years after his disappearance. The most enduring theories suggest Harmon may have crossed into Mexico voluntarily that evening and met with foul play on the other side of the border. Border crossing records from 1959 were notoriously incomplete, and a person could cross without leaving significant documentation, especially if they walked across rather than driving. Another theory proposed by retired Detective Martinez in a 1979 interview suggests Harmon may have had a second identity and used the El Paso trip to disappear deliberately. Some men run from debts, some from women, some from the law, Martinez said. But in all my years on the force, I never saw someone disappear so completely without leaving some trace behind. Today, the Paso del Norte Hotel still stands, though it's been renovated and changed ownership several times. Room 412, where James Harmon spent his final known hours, remains in use, with many guests unaware of its connection to one of El Paso's most perplexing mysteries. Some hotel staff claim the room occasionally experiences unexplained phenomena, lights flickering, phones ringing with no caller, and the sensation of being watched. Though these claims remain firmly in the realm of local legend rather than documented fact. James Harmon would be in his 90s today if still alive. His disappearance remains officially unsolved, one of dozens of cold cases in the El Paso Police Department archives. The question remains: did he fall victim to foul play? Did he choose to disappear? Or did something even more sinister occur in room 412 of the Paso del Norte Hotel on that warm March evening in 1959?
This is the last photograph of Elizabeth Reynolds and her baby boy, captured just 40 minutes before their beach house collapsed into the churning Gulf waters during Hurricane Hilda's fury in October 1964. The young mother stands on the wooden porch of their weekend getaway, cradling 10-month-old Michael in her arms, eyes fixed on the distant horizon where dark clouds gather. She couldn't have known what was coming. Elizabeth and her husband James had purchased the modest, stilted beach house on Galveston's West End just months earlier, a retreat from their busy lives in Houston, where James worked as a petroleum engineer. That fateful weekend, James was away on an offshore assignment, leaving Beth and Michael alone when early warnings about Hurricane Hilda began circulating. Though the hurricane's direct path was projected to strike Louisiana, weather officials had warned about dangerous conditions extending along the Texas coast. The morning had dawned deceptively calm on October 3rd, with only a steady breeze and slightly higher than normal waves breaking along the shoreline. Beth called her sister in Houston around noon, mentioning the strengthening winds but expressing no serious concern. "The radio says the storm's heading for Louisiana, not here," she said. "We'll be fine in our little house on stilts." By mid-afternoon, however, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The wind intensified and the Gulf began to rise. A neighbor who lived in one of the few year-round residences nearby later reported seeing Beth loading suitcases into her car around 3 p.m., apparently attempting to evacuate. But the rapidly rising water had already made the road impassable. She returned to the elevated house, which at that point still seemed secure on its 12-foot wooden pilings. What Beth couldn't see was how the strengthening storm surge was already eroding the sand from around the base of those pilings. While Galveston's famous seawall protected much of the main island, their beach house sat in the unprotected western stretch, directly exposed to the full force of the Gulf's fury. At 5:30 p.m., Beth made a frantic phone call to her sister-in-law. "The water's up to the bottom of the house now. The whole building is shaking with each wave. I tried the car again, but the road's completely underwater." Her sister-in-law urged her to signal for help, to try reaching higher ground, anything. "I'll keep Michael safe," were reportedly Beth's last words before the line went dead. Around 7:30 p.m., as the storm reached its peak intensity along the Galveston coast, several neighboring structures had already succumbed to the combination of wind and water. Debris from these buildings became battering rams against the remaining structures. Witnesses from a sturdier concrete home nearby described the horrifying sight of the Reynolds Beach House first tilting precariously as two of its support pilings gave way, then collapsing entirely into the raging storm surge. The tragedy of Beth and Michael Reynolds became a powerful reminder of Hurricane Hilda's deadly reach beyond its Louisiana landfall. Though the storm's direct impact on Galveston wasn't as devastating as previous hurricanes, like the infamous 1900 storm or Hurricane Carla in 1961, it still claimed lives through storm surge and flooding in areas outside the seawall's protection. In the aftermath, James Reynolds became a vocal advocate for stricter building codes along the Texas coast and improved hurricane warning systems. A small memorial stone marked with Elizabeth and Michael, 1964, still stands in the Galveston Memorial Park Cemetery, though their bodies were never recovered from the Gulf. The photograph, the last one ever taken of them, had been snapped by a neighbor who was documenting the approaching storm. It shows Beth in a simple white blouse, her dark hair blowing across her face as she holds Michael close, looking out at the water that would soon claim them both.